In August of 1945, 2 atomic bombs brought the war to a rapid conclusion. When Japan surrendered, there was really no one in control of Vietnam. Ho moved quickly into the gap. With General Vo Nguyen Giap leading his guerrilla forces, they took control of the north.
That must have been an electrifying experience for the masses, and they must have felt that this was the moment.
On September 2nd, 1945, nearly 500,000 people attended a huge rally in Hanoi. Ho gave an independence speech that began with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
He quoted directly from Declaration of Independence, and maybe what he was doing was flattering the United States so that they could be on his side. He was disarming his opponents by saying that he was not going for Marxist revolution, he was only going for plain, simple independence for his country.
He'd admit to being a communist. He said, you know, my purpose is to free up Indochina. I'm not doing anything different than you did in 1776. You managed to deal with it pretty well, and that's all I'm trying to do now. Do you have any problem with that?
Ho had no illusions about the tenuous nature of Vietnamese independence. In perfect English, he wrote a letter to his OSS contacts stating, "The war is won, but we small and subject countries have no share, or very, very small share, in the victory of freedom and democracy. Probably, if we want to get a sufficient share, we have still to fight." Ho went to Paris in 1946 in hopes of working out a compromise where Vietnam could become autonomous within the French Commonwealth.
I think Ho Chi Minh was trying to postpone the inevitability of armed conflict with France, because I think he was under no illusion that the French would give up without a fight.
Ho's mission to Paris failed. Back in Vietnam, conditions were even worse than they had been before World War II. The French army returned and brutalized the country. As many as 2 million Vietnamese starved to death during a famine, while rice was exported to France. Ho appealed to the U.S. for mediation, but never even received a reply. The emerging Cold War between the Soviet Union and America made France's participation in the defense of Western Europe critical to the U.S. The French agreed to cooperate with the Americans, but the U.S. had to keep out of France's colonial affairs.
Ho Chi Minh was meeting with a rather sympathetic French official. He said to him something that is very, very important, that the French didn't understand at the time, and which also becomes important later for the United States. He says, if we go to war, we're going to lose 10 men for every one that you lose. But in the end, we'll win and you'll lose.
By the end of 1946, Ho, General Giap, and the Viet Minh were back in the jungle fighting a guerrilla war against the French. Initially, it seemed unlikely that the Viet Minh would have any hope in defeating the French. But by 1954, the French were desperate to end the bloody guerrilla war that seemed to have no end in sight. The French decided to spring a trap for the Viet Minh at a place called Dien Bien Phu. They believed that the ensuing battle would end the Indochina War. It did end the war, but in a way they could never have imagined. In March of 1954, the French army believed that they had lured Ho Chi Minh's forces into a trap near a remote outpost called Dien Bien Phu. Unfortunately for the French, they only trapped themselves. The battle cost the French over 15,000 casualties. It also cost them Indochina. The Viet Minh victory over the French marked the first time that a European power had been defeated in battle by its colony since the American Revolution. Ho's leadership and tenacity contributed greatly to the victory, as did the aid of a powerful new ally, the Red Chinese. Ho tried to play down the Chinese Communist support. He feared that this alliance would drag Vietnam into the Cold War.
And this would mean, therefore, that Vietnamese independence would not be a local question between Viet Minh and the French, but would be now an international question between the two superpowers.
Despite the victory at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam's fate would ultimately be decided at a peace conference in Geneva. Both the Soviet Union and Red China urged Ho to accept the terms of the Geneva Peace Agreement, which divided the country in half at the 17th parallel. It took all of Ho's political skill to get his colleagues to accept the compromise. After 1954, Ho and the Communists concentrated on building a socialist state in the North. They implemented a land reform program modeled after the one created by Mao in China.
And it was a very brutal program. Lots of landowners were executed. It was very corrupt in many cases. The story is that Ho Chi Minh actually realized this thing had gotten out of hand and apologized for it, but of course it was too late. These people had been killed.
The North did not have the only repressive government in Indochina. The U.S. helped install an anti-communist dictator in the South named Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was not popular with his countrymen. In the Geneva Peace Treaty, Ho had been promised an end to foreign intervention and nationwide elections, which he most certainly would have won. Diem and his U.S. backers did not allow the elections to take place. By 1960, an anti-Diem resistance movement engulfed the South in a guerrilla war. The more the North supported the guerrillas, or Viet Cong, the more the U.S. intervened to counter the spread of communism. Just as Ho had feared, Vietnam had become the key battlefield of the Cold War.
We had this idiotic idea that communism was a monolith, that all communists were the same, and Ho was part of that monolith. But there's a lot of evidence that he wasn't. If only we had come to the point where we'd say, okay, he's a communist, but he's our communist, you know?
By 1966, the Vietnam War was in full swing. By now, Ho was 76 years old and probably not involved in the day-to-day conduct of the war. But he was still the prime source of inspiration to the Vietnamese people to fight on, no matter the cost. Ho Chi Minh died on September 2nd, 1969, at the age of 79. Though it would be almost 6 more years before the final Vietnamese victory, most of Ho's countrymen believed that he was the one most responsible for the liberation and unification of Vietnam. Today, Ho Chi Minh's legacy is as controversial and complex as the man himself.
There is, on the one hand, the image of Ho Chi Minh as the patriot, the leader of his country's struggle for national liberation, the man of simple tastes, a man who is almost more Confucian than he is a Marxist or a Leninist. The other image of Ho Chi Minh is as an international communist agent, the head of a repressive regime which carried out policies deeply repugnant to many Vietnamese.
I think you got to deal with the dual character of this man. At the same time that you have this image of the kindly, wispy, emaciated, frail Ho Chi Minh, you got to remember underneath that is a really tough figure, absolutely dedicated, absolutely relentless.
The ends were always more important than the means to Ho Chi Minh. But some critics believe that the communist economic and political system that he left behind was too high a price for independence and unification.
Ho Chi Minh said in 1945, they would like to have Vietnam independence, freedom, and happiness. And from the three slogans, what is left right now? Independence, yes, but what does it mean without having freedom and happiness?
There's no doubt that the communists under Ho often brutally eliminated their political opponents. But Ho's role in this is not clear.
Ho was the leader at the time, and errors did take place, so he should take some of the blame. I think he was a very driven man, a man driven by the cause that he believed in.
As a young man, Ho dreamed of changing the lives of the Vietnamese people, but he probably never dreamed how much he would also change the United States.
Ho Chi Minh hands the United States the first defeat in its history, in the longest war of its history. And in that respect, he should teach us a lesson, which is you don't get involved in wars in these places when you're up against enemies that are intensely, passionately nationalistic and are prepared to make these limitless sacrifices to win.
Recent estimates of Vietnamese casualties since 1946 are placed at over 3,500,000 dead. This staggering number is a reflection of the steely determination of Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people.
Ho Chi Minh's enduring legacy, in terms of his image and the way he is seen around the world, I think probably he's remembered perhaps more than anything else as the leader of probably the most successful movement for national liberation that we've seen in our century.
Ho Chi Minh accomplished an incredible feat in helping to free his country and unite it despite the opposition of France and the United States. This achievement required the efforts of a man who was part Lenin, part Gandhi, part Confucius, and all Vietnamese. Ho supported himself through a variety of odd jobs. He worked as a cook and he retouched photos. He even reported on boxing matches and reviewed films for a French newspaper. Of course, his primary goal was to somehow organize Vietnamese expatriates into a movement that would pressure the French government into improving conditions in his homeland.
People who encountered Ho Chi Minh in those days tended to say pretty much the same things. A very intense young man, very anxious to learn, very idealistic, a man very much driven by ideas. But what was remembered about him perhaps more than anything else was his sharp eyes. It essentially seemed to penetrate the soul of the person who was talking to him.
Ho discovered that there were many Frenchmen who were sympathetic to his cause. These liberals encouraged him to join their socialist group and to write and publish his own ideas. Soon, Ho and other Vietnamese expatriates began publishing an anti-colonial newspaper directed toward the Vietnamese community in France. Their leaflets were even smuggled back to Vietnam.
All of his writings really are on that theme. What a rotten deal colonials are getting all over the French Empire, which indeed they were. Ho's point of thinking is, how do you fix this? Do you fix it with revolution? Do you fix it with violence? How do you do it?
Writing under the pseudonym Nguyen Ai Quoc, or Nguyen the Patriot, Ho simply advocated better treatment and equal rights for his people, not revolution. He achieved a near-legendary status in certain circles back in Vietnam, where his rhetoric was considered visionary. Ho also attracted the attention of the imperial regime back home. They accused him of inciting treason and condemned him to death if he ever returned to Vietnam. In 1919, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson traveled to the Versailles Peace Conference. to present his famous 14-point plan for world peace. Ho and his associates discovered that one of Wilson's key points was that all nations deserve the right to self-determination. Ho believed that this meant that the U.S. was advocating the end of the colonial system.
And Ho Chi Minh, thinking that this might apply to Vietnam, got himself all dressed up in a cutaway coat and striped pants and a top hat, and he went out to Versailles carrying with him a document that he had written, which was a kind of inventory of various cases of French repression in Vietnam. And his idea was to give this to Wilson so that the United States would then exert pressure on France. Well, he got very rudely rebuffed when he tried to go in to see Wilson or even deliver this.
Ho had believed that President Wilson would be sympathetic to Vietnam's plight. He was greatly disappointed that he was unable to present his case. This forced him to look elsewhere for help. A socialist showed Ho a paper that had been written by Vladimir Lenin. In it, the Soviet leader wrote that one of the keys to the spread of communism was the liberation of all colonies.
The Russians wanted to end colonialism not because they loved the people who were under colonial rule, but for their own selfish interests. They wanted to weaken the Western powers. But regardless of what their motivation was, they were the only power at the time to advocate it and to actively want to offer help.
And it's at that point, as he basically points out, that he determined to become a follower of Lenin, not because he had any understanding of Marxist ideology, but because he loved the strategy that Lenin had set forth as a means of liberating the colonial peoples.
In 1920, Ho became one of the founding members of the French Communist Party. He was 30 years old. He had become a great propagandist while living in Paris, but he wanted to learn how to turn rhetoric into revolutionary action. He believed there was really only one place to learn this craft: Moscow. In 1923, Ho received an invitation to join the Comintern, the organization set up by the Soviets to export Marxism and Leninism around the world. He jumped at the opportunity. He disappeared from Paris, leaving his friends wondering what had happened to him.
I think what drew Ho to Moscow, first and foremost, was nationalism, the desire to find help to liberate his country and his people.
Ho became an important member of the Comintern. He now took his orders from Moscow.
I always felt that Ho Chi Minh had very little time for Marxism as a philosophy, as a way of interpreting history. He had great admiration for Leninism and the techniques and the methods to be used.
The rest of the world may have abhorred Lenin's tactics, but Ho was devoted to them. He believed that he had found the blueprint for liberating his homeland. Ho received his first international assignment when he was sent to Canton in South China to help organize communist cadres. It was here that he also began a clandestine lifestyle that would last nearly 30 years.
He went underground, so to speak. And you have him wandering around the world under a wide variety of aliases. Some of them Vietnamese, some of them Chinese, depending on where he was and what purpose he needed. If, for example, he contributed to a French newspaper, he'd call himself Victor Le Bon. If he contributed to a Russian newspaper, he'd call himself Nafransky, and so forth.
In 1927, Ho was nearly arrested when the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek turned against the communists. Ho narrowly escaped capture and a likely death sentence, and eventually made his way to Siam, or present-day Thailand. He avoided detection by agents of the Sûreté, or French secret police, via a clever ruse. He learned some Thai, shaved his head, donned a saffron robe, and traveled as a Buddhist monk. There was a large Vietnamese community living in northeast Thailand, so Ho preached his cause as he wandered from village to village in disguise.
I don't know of any other leader of his stature having done this kind of masquerading under different guises or having had to change his name so many times, which makes me wonder whether this was just a necessity or was it the sense of the drama in the man that prompted him to do this.
For most of the 1930s, Ho's whereabouts were not known. He had even been reported dead.
Ho just disappeared. He was either in the cave of Yan'an with Mao, he was in a Stalin jail. There's no world figure that you can say that we don't know where he was for almost a decade. And again, this was not accidental. I mean, he didn't want to be found.
Ho emerged again on the world stage shortly before the outbreak of World War II. He'd always believed that there would one day be a time when the conditions would be just right to begin the liberation of his homeland. When France fell to Germany in the early months of World War II, and the pro-German Vichy government took over the colonial rule of Vietnam, Ho believed that the moment had arrived. In early 1941, he slipped across the Chinese border and into the jungles of North Vietnam. Incredibly, this was the first time Ho had set foot in his homeland in over 30 years. He was armed only with his ideas, but he was determined to lead a revolution, to liberate his country, or to die trying.